what we think happened was a kind of chemical evolution, which is very much like biological evolution. That what happened is that there were various small molecules that could interact and promote the synthesis of other small molecules. So what happened is that somehow those chemicals had to be created. And the way we think they happened, they were created, is again, fairly naturally. That it turns out that if you take just the molecules that existed in an inorganic situation and you subject them to things like pressure, heat, you cause things like lightning, for instance, all this sort of stuff. It promotes chemical reactions that can produce these complex, smaller molecules.
Now, when it comes to those who don't start with the Bible, they would say in the beginning matter or in the beginning hydrogen, that matter gave rise to life, and yet observational science does not confirm that.
Well, maybe it came from outer space. Well, maybe these things just, somehow got together and over time this happened, but it's just not, things don't do that. We know that from our own experience, You don't just put all the parts of a watch, on the ground and expect a watch to form. It's not going to happen. We know there has to be an intelligence behind that. So it really goes contrary to even what our common experience is and what we know has to happen for these kinds of complex things to come about.
Initially what you would have had is organisms that just sort of glommed together in large colonies. Things like a sponge, for instance. A sponge doesn't have a body plan, really. I mean, they've got a little bit of one, but they don't have much of what you would call a body plan. So there are organisms that are then selected to just glom together for defensive purposes. We're bigger, we're more efficient at slurping in food, that kind of thing. Early life then progressed to another step, which is defining polarity, okay? That one of the fundamental things these early animals did was they figured out how to make a head end and a front end. That's essential if you're going to do things like move, right? If you don't have a head end and a front end, you sort of sit there and wiggle, and you don't get anywhere. What we think happened there was well, we know that there are various proteins that are involved in that in modern organisms. And we look at the developmental programs that build, for instance, your head versus your tail end, and we identify the proteins that are involved there. And we look at all these other animals, and the surprising thing we've discovered is they're pretty much the same everywhere. And most animals use the same molecules to do these fundamental tasks of just saying which end is up. And so what would have happened is early on there would have been a protein, for instance, that would be produced by the animal. It's only produced on one side. What the trigger in the ancient trigger would be, we don't know. It could be something like, well, wherever the sun is shining down, that's one end, and where it's dark, we'll build a different protein, and you get these different proteins forming on these different layers, and that leads to differentiation of different cell types in these areas. So that's where we start, is the first step in our kind of body plan is figuring out what's the front end, what's the tail end. We don't know the details. We don't know all the steps that are involved. All we know is a general principle that seems to work very, very well. And that's that Darwinian principle. That what we think happened is that you would have some situation, and again, it's highly undefined.
Darwin himself worked explicitly in the context of the theory of a concept of design. That is, that the explanation for life as we see it was distinctly and explicitly designed by a creator.
This is what I tell people when they ask me, there's always a possibility that some aliens came cruising by in their space Winnebago and decided to flush the tanks over Earth. And that's where we came from. We can't rule that out.
The question of the origin of life, the origin of the universe, where we came from, is a historical question. It's a question of origins. You can't go out to the Grand Canyon and recreate the Grand Canyon in the laboratory. You have to look at the evidence of the rocks and the fossils and try to reconstruct the past. What happened to cause that?
A lot of people think that because the universe is expanding, that somehow indicates a Big Bang. The Big Bang is actually came along later. The expansion of the universe was discovered first in the 1920s. And then Lemaitre came up with the Big Bang in 1931. He came up with the idea that the universe had started from a point, and that point had expanded out. And so that is an explanation for that expansion. But see, there are other explanations for that expansion too. Just because something's getting bigger doesn't mean that it exploded into existence billions of years ago. I mean, you can inflate a balloon, but that doesn't mean it started as a point. It started smaller, but it didn't start as a point. In fact, Lemaitre's first model in 1928, I believe, actually did not start with a point. He started with the universe with finite size, and then it just expands. And that's basically what I believe is a creationist. God created the universe with a finite size, and it's expanded some since then for whatever reason.
Now, you're watching their answers. You don't see my questions, but I am asking the questions on the other side of the camera. It might be fun for you to note down how many times it seems like I've asked them, how? How does this happen? And you can also see that I'm not really getting much of an answer, am I?
You know, here at the Creation Museum, when the secular media come in here, others in the secular world to interview me, most of the questions are not about evolution. Most of the questions are about the age of the Earth. And the reason is because if you don't have an incomprehensible amount of time, you can't postulate evolution. You've got to have an incomprehensible amount of time. You've got to have millions of years. And that's why they're so emotional and adamant about the millions of years. And yet much of the church has said we can have the millions of years, which actually undermines the authority of Scripture.
I mean, the only evidence they can trot out, for instance, is, you know, if you're a creationist, is the Bible, which is a kind of evidence, but it's very poor evidence for a scientific hypothesis. In particular, we know that the authors of the Bible weren't around in the Cambrian. So they have no qualifications to speak of what happened in the Cambrian. However, the rocks were there, and it's when we analyze the rocks can we find more accurate evidence of what happened at that time.
The evidence is clear, and the evidence doesn't speak for itself. Okay, DNA doesn't talk, rocks don't talk, fossils don't talk. I speak for them, or everybody speaks for them. And so what do I think about those things? What do I think? How did they get there? What do they show? Every piece of evidence out there supports what Scripture says.
Sparks fly when scientists collide. All that and more as the great debate continues.